Hello and welcome to the Davos Daily Show. I'm Andrew Hill, the FT's senior business writer, coming to you from the World Economic Forum in Davos, where over the next 3 days we'll be talking to some of the world's most influential leaders for their insights about the risks and opportunities ahead. Today it's all about economic growth. What's fueling it, what's holding it back, and where do the opportunities lie? We begin with the FT editorial view, where Gideon Rachman and I will set the stage with geopolitical and geoeconomic analysis. Then we move on to discuss the economic outlook, with leading voices discussing how to tackle inflation and handle investment strategy. Later you'll see my FT leaders interview with Adina Friedman, Chief Executive and Chair of NASDAQ. We'll talk about the economic opportunities and risks ahead. Finally, we'll explore the transformative potential of artificial intelligence with our panel Expectation versus Reality. How will AI drive growth? It's an agenda packed with sharp debate and bold insights. Stay tuned for the Davos Daily Show with me, Andrew Hill, brought to you by FT Live. Hello and welcome to the Davos Daily Show on the day after the inauguration of President Donald Trump. It makes the front page of the FT and virtually every other newspaper on the planet. And I'm delighted to be joined for our first discussion of this first Davos Daily Show by our Chief Foreign Affairs commentator, Gideon Rachman. Gideon, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome back. You were here with us last year when we were already talking about the prospect of a year of elections. And we've had an inauguration unlike any that we've seen before.
Yeah.
Have we learnt anything new from what Trump has already said and done in his first hours in office?
Yes, I think we have. I mean, the thing about Trump is, over the course of a campaign or indeed a day, he'll throw out so much stuff that a lot of what people are trying to figure out is, well, which bit of this do we take seriously? So we were watching to see, well, what are the many things he's talked about has he go for in the inaugural speech? So he went much harder on Panama than I thought he would. I mean, you could read it almost as a declaration of war on Panama, not in a legal sense, but saying we're going to take the canal back. He said we're going to expand America's territory, which I assume was a reference to the Greenland claim. But a lot of the other stuff in the speech was a bit more measured, self-congratulatory, triumphalist than, say, his first inaugural, which was the famous American Carnage speech. The mood was a bit more upbeat, actually. But then when later in the day, he retreats to the Oval Office and starts issuing these executive orders and talking about them. And actually, I think there was more real meat in those, where he withdraws America from the World Health Organization and also starts talking about if you've been the Canadians and the Mexicans and you listen to the inaugural, you thought, phew, he hasn't mentioned us. But then the next, a couple of hours later, he's talking about imposing 25% tariffs on America's two closest neighbors, most intense trading partners on February the 1st. And it's not even clear what they've got to do to avert that. So that is an incredibly disruptive move if he does it.
Right. So we're here up in Davos. It's day one of the discussions. As usual, there are things happening off stage, and this one dramatically off stage, that will dominate a lot of the discussion. It's probably too early to say exactly how the Davos group community is responding, but Trump himself is not going to be here. He is going to be addressing the forum on Thursday remotely.
So we're told, yeah.
What do you think is going to be the effect of this Trump presidency on the people who are gathered here? And what sort of response do you expect from this group, business?
Well, part of me thinks, although you wouldn't think it by the traffic jams, that maybe we're in the sort of death throes of Davos, because Davos represented a sort of certain phase in world history, I think, which was globalization, the opening of markets, the idea that business leaders and political leaders from literally all over the world, be it China, Russia, I mean, Putin, I met Putin in Davos, that they would all assemble here, and whatever their political differences, they would have this common project of globalization. And that is the project that Trump is really intent on destroying. And globalists are his enemy. I thought in a real globalist moment, I watched the inaugural address on my phone in a traffic jam in Davos. But you know, on the other hand, the business people here are nothing if not adaptable. They do business all over the world in very difficult places, and so their reaction generally would be to say, okay, so what's the new situation we face? How do we make sense of it, and how do we do business in that climate? And if we can't, we move somewhere else. And I think that will be the reaction of business people. I mean, I think a lot of the things that Trump is attacking, like, for example, DEI, diversity, inclusion, and all that, they adopted, if this doesn't sound too cynical, because it was the fashion of the day, and that's what you needed to do as a business. And if they're told, okay, don't do this anymore, they'll put it to one side or downplay it. But if he actually blows up the world trading system, that becomes a bit more difficult. And some of the things, you know, for example, withdrawing from the World Health Organization will have implications that, you know, companies like GlaxoSmithKline, et cetera, the big pharma companies will have to start thinking through.
Yes. And this is, of course, a Trump administration that is really hand in glove with US big business, big tech business in particular. They were literally surrounding him at the inauguration itself, the big names, Bezos, Zuckerberg, of course, Elon Musk. That arguably could, to some degree, give comfort to some big businesses who think, well, we can just now ally ourselves with the Trump agenda. But I've already heard up here in Davos a suggestion that, well, this is too much power concentrated in one place, Silicon Valley, or what we think of metaphorically as Silicon Valley, and too much power concentrated in the US business establishment. Sure. So there is this oligarchy forming around him, which poses a threat to some businesses which aren't part of that group.
Yeah, absolutely. And I noticed that you know, one of the people who could be part of that group but has chosen to be in Davos instead is Bill Gates, right? Who's here, but possibly sufficiently rich and self-confident to feel he doesn't need to demean himself in the way that Zuckerberg has. But yeah, I thought it was very, very striking. And I think the thing about an oligarchy is it's great if you're one of the members of it that may be slightly insecure. But if you're a smaller business trying to break in, you're in trouble, you know. And if you're a foreign business, equally you're in trouble. And what we're seeing, you know, with TikTok, the original argument against TikTok was that it was a national security threat, in which case, obviously, they would have to take it out of the system. But now it looks more like a shakedown. You know, you give us 50% of this, or we're going to tariff China. So it's more like we just want some of that.
Yes. Let's just talk a little bit about tariffs, because that is clearly one of the issues, as you've suggested, that the Davos elite is worrying about, and indeed the economic elite of the world are worrying about. We'll be talking about it later in the show when we're discussing the outlook for the economy. Clearly it can be highly disruptive. There's already a sense that some of the world is reforming around different blocs. The EU has been signing deals with Mercosur and Mexico, which obviously reminds us that there are other big trading blocs out there. It is to some extent an unknown. We don't know which tariffs and where quite exactly.
And indeed, he did, by the by, also threaten the EU with tariffs.
Yes, yes. But is there a way in which the rest of the world might be somehow galvanized by this threat?
Completely. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't know whether they'll be galvanized effectively, but obviously you start thinking about working together if you're all under some sort of common attack from the US. And I think one of the big questions about this is Trump overplaying America's hand? What he's done is a sort of massive bet on American power, believing that essentially because of the reserve currency status, the leadership in tech, the military power, America, the size of their market, America is essentially irresistible. And people will just have to do what they say. But we'll see if that's correct. And I do think that here in Europe, there will be, you know, the cliches that European integration happens as a result of crises. There will be a drive to try to integrate more deeply and to do these deals with other parts of the world. And one of the things I think that could backfire for the Americans is that I think Europe will start looking at doing a deal with China.
Yes.
Because, you know, one of the successes of the Biden administration was to actually pull the Europeans much closer to the US's China policy, to get the Europeans to take part in this whole strategy of de-risking and being much more cautious about foreign direct investment from China. But if the US now goes after its allies, then you have Europeans saying, well, you know, we can't do the green transition anyway without Chinese tech, without the solar panels, the batteries, etc. So let's just do a deal with China.
Right, and China is the great sort of imponderable in this. It's obviously the gigantic economy. The US-China relationship is critical to what happens in the rest of the world. They seem to have been so far rather wait and see on the Trump situation. Yeah. What do you think is going to evolve there, and when, from the China side?
I suspect, unless they're some kind of master geniuses, they're as confused as the rest of us.
Right.
You know, they're looking to see where the opportunities are, where the deals are, how tough he's going to be. But I think some of the signals that Trump is sending is that he wants a deal with China. You know, the TikTok thing is essentially a deal. You know, some of the early Chinese commentary I've seen, they're pretty pleased, I think, because they think that he'll be much less inclined to push back against China on Taiwan, that he's solely focused on trade and trade figures. The question is, there are a lot of China hawks around Trump, and if they have their way, the policy really will be highly confrontational. So there's a hint of a kind of dissonance between Trump himself and the people he's appointing.
Right, interesting. So geo-economic confrontation was number 3 on the World Economic Forum's risk survey that came out last week. Extreme weather was number 2. State-based armed conflict was number 1.
Yeah.
And clearly we do have conflict in the world. Ukraine is still a live issue. Gaza is live, but at the moment, a delicate truce and ceasefire. What's your view about where these major conflicts with global implications are heading now?
Look, it's hard to tell. I mean, I think the one thing that makes me think positively about Trump, and you may have gathered I'm not a huge fan, but I mean, I think when he said, I want to be a peacemaker, I think that is the case. That he's not that interested in war, it's bad for business. And also, there was a line in the speech where he said, we're going to end wars, and we're going to end wars we should never even consider getting into in the first place. And it's interesting, when I was last in Washington, a lot of the people who are backing him on the foreign policy side are military veterans, what the so-called restrainers, who say, look, the war in Iraq was a mistake, the war in Afghanistan was a mistake, like, we're not doing this anymore. And frankly, the Europeans can look after themselves, and, you know, why should we support Ukraine? We may feel sorry for them, but it's a long way away. And I think that's sort of Trump's view. And I think that on the Israel stuff, it has a huge dynamic of its own, and the Israelis, I think, are quite keen to go back again and hammer Hamas one more time. So maybe it won't work, but I think that Trump, you know, actually, oddly, is in a position to be tougher with Israel than Biden was, because he has no threat from the right. You know, if Biden had, say, cut off military aid to Israel, he would have been crucified in the American right-wing media. Trump can kind of do it if he wants to. So I think you saw him put pressure on Netanyahu in a way that Biden wasn't willing to do. He'll try some of the same in trying to force a peace deal in Russia-Ukraine. I think the risk of war is not that Trump causes it or commits America to a conflict. It's that he sends the signal that America is so uninterested that the Russias and Chinas of this world say, oh, well, in that case, you know, we can maybe sort of, if you're Russia, start pecking away at Ukraine again, or maybe even going after the Baltic states, which are in NATO, depending on how weak America's commitment is, or that China feels it has the green light to go after Taiwan. And then you have wars actually being started inadvertently by a man who's trying to be a peacemaker.
Right. As we've said, Trump's not here in person in Davos. A few world leaders are. Who are you interested in hearing from? Who do you think is important to talk to here?
Well, later this afternoon, I'll be in a session with Zelensky, which will be interesting. And von der Leyen is speaking, I think, later this morning, and that will be the head of the European Commission. And I think that will be a very important moment, because some of what we're talking about, you know, how much can Europe organize itself, will come to the fore. And for her in particular, it's very tough. She has been probably the most pro-American president of the European Commission ever. I mean, I remember some of her critics in Brussels describing her to me as the Vice President of the United States.
Right.
They felt she'd overdone it with Biden. So now she has some real thinking to do.
It's a very crucial speech for her, this, actually.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Nice. And in terms of what might come out of the days here, obviously consensus emerges. It's always the caricature that the Davos consensus is never right. Is there some value to a Davos consensus in a world which is preparing for a 4 years more of Trump?
I actually don't think there'll be a consensus this time, because I think it's such a head-spinning time that everybody's trying to what? It's odd. People read you can see people laughing as they read the news, which is in the way that you do when there's this sort of crazy shock, and people laugh when they're shocked.
Yes.
And that's what they're doing.
Yes.
And everybody's running off in different directions. There'll be people who say, oh, it's a transaction. There'll be people who say, it's the end of the world. Maybe the truth is somewhere between the two.
Yes. I do detect a sense of businesses certainly saying, okay, well, everything's up in the air, so that is opportunity for us and so on. But we will see over the next 2 days. Gideon Rachman, thank you for joining us to get the Davos Daily Show off to a great start. We'll be next with a live panel discussing the economic implications of Trump and the future of the economy of the world in what is expected to be an extraordinarily exciting and indeed volatile year ahead.
For over 130 years, the Financial Times has been recognized internationally for its authority, integrity, and accuracy.
FT Live builds on this legacy by bringing you global events on business-critical issues. From the rapid rise of artificial intelligence to economic shocks and geopolitical risk, our events examine the disruptive forces facing decision makers in today's complex world.
You never know when the opportunity may come. Just be ready.
Football is for everybody.
The only way you're going to break through that noise is innovation, and the only way you innovate is by tapping into different talent pools.
The only way you kill an idea is with a better idea.
Hard questions.
Why? Why did you agree to this?
Intelligent answers.
In a crisis, you really have to focus on what you can control.
Crucial connections.
Engage with leaders, acquire essential insights, gain an edge with FT Live.
Welcome back. Since we recorded that interview with Gideon Rachman this morning, Ursula von der Leyen has given that crucial speech which we were talking about, and she has warned of a race to the bottom on trade. And that's one of the topics that we're going to discuss today with an expert panel, not just one, but two chief economists, Beata Jaworczyk from the EBRD, Karen Kimbrough from LinkedIn, and Axel Carlson from McKinsey. We are going to talk about the future of the global economy, but we will start, Beata, with tariffs. Trump has said shortly after his inauguration that he's going to impose 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico as early as February the 1st, up to 100% on Chinese imports if China doesn't sell 50% of TikTok to a US company, tariffs on EU products unless they buy US oil. I mean, this is a disruptor in chief is already disrupting. What are your fears for the near future on trade with the European bloc and others?
Well, this is the latest salvo in the process of fragmentation of the global economy. But remember, this process has been going on for a while. 2016, we had the Brexit referendum and rolling back integration in services between the UK and the EU. 2018, US-China trade war started, the administration changed, but the tariffs on China remained. And the CHIPS Act was passed, which restricted technology flows to China. China responded with export restrictions on critical raw materials. And then 2022, sanctions on Russia, which led to a dramatic drop in Western trade with Russia. So a lot has already been happening. But in anticipation to latest changes in the US policy, the EU has become more active when it comes to free trade agreements. So I would expect more action on preferential trade agreements, like-minded countries getting together and deepening their cooperation. So paradoxically, actually, the US policy can give impetus to more preferential trade agreements.
So is this the continuation of a fragmentation of the world trading order that we were already seeing, or is it something else, actually a sort of reconstituting of the globalized order into different blocks?
So we have been seeing these big changes in the flows of foreign direct investment. For instance, there is much less FDI from the US flowing to China, no FDI flowing from the West to Russia. So there is less interaction between the rival blocs. We see big changes when it comes to currencies used to invoice trade. In 2016, 90% of Chinese exports to Russia were denominated in renminbi. By the end of 2023, over 80%, in 2016, 90% were denominated in the US dollar. By the end of 2023, 80% were in renminbi. So we are seeing big changes, big shifts, and that brings us closer to the world of two rival blocs.
Right. Axel, turning to you, the implications of Trump, obviously they're going to unfold over the next 4 years. But what are you already picking up and thinking in terms of the kind of backwash for business and the economy?
So I'm no expert on tariffs, but I think in the short run we'll see an amplification of the trends we've already seen. So I think it will be difficult for Europe. I think we'll see continued growth in North America, and we'll see continued growth in some of the Southeast Asian states, Vietnam, Indonesia, where we've seen it already. Then I think in the long run, let's see what happens, and let's see what actually happens to the tariffs as well. I think we've gotten used to a different way of speaking from government leaders in America. It's maybe no longer for the long run, but for the short run. So let's see what really happens in the long run. It will be also interesting to watch inflation in America. We have a situation where American GDP versus European GDP is at an all-time high since the Second World War. And the American Stock Exchange is at an all-time high as a valuation in percent of American GDP. And now with additional tariffs and more growth being pumped into North America, what will happen to inflation? That will be very interesting to follow, I think.
Right, and I want to come back later to also the divergence there between America and the rest of the world on growth. But Karen, coming to you, I mean, one of the things fueling inflation is because of a very tight labour market there. That's something that LinkedIn looks at very closely, monitoring that kind of data. What is happening in the business outlook that you see, picking up on the things that Axel and Beata have already talked about?
Well, if 2024 was a year of a very sluggish market where literally people weren't really changing jobs, they weren't quitting, layoffs weren't elevated, and businesses weren't hiring at any sense of a fast speed, I would say 2025 is the year where we start to get a little bit more momentum in the labor market. We're expecting to see against a solid growth backdrop, generally speaking, for employers to start to be willing to open up more roles, and we're going to see a lot more job seeking. So we'll still have a very competitive job market. It will probably not be as tight as before, but we are expecting it to be a lot more dynamic in the sense of people moving around, more jobs being backfilled, more people in search of new opportunities than we've seen in the past.
And how does that break down globally from the figures that you see? Are the differences already emerging between US, Europe? Asia Pacific?
Two things I would probably point out is one, the US is most certainly starting to see a little bit of a reacceleration in hiring. For 2 years, there has been literally a slowing in hiring by employers. And since the last month or two, we've seen an acceleration. So positive growth, more hiring year over year than we've seen in 2 years. So which I think speaks to this sort of business sentiment and optimism at this moment that you're seeing across large and small companies are willing to kind of say maybe 2025 is a year where we wake from our slumber. In Europe, we do actually think it's a little bit of an oversold story, all the negativity. And we actually are seeing green shoots of hiring that are speeding up as well in Germany, France, and the UK. So we're a little more constructive on Europe than a lot of the other economists out there.
Right, so a little bit of good news there for the CEO of a recruitment company who I met at breakfast this morning, who'd been talking to his peers and saying that they had this unprecedented situation where their business, which obviously depends on people hiring and moving, was quite sluggish, but the economy was going great guns. So they might get a bit in 2025, a bit of...
I think so. I think some of the momentum that we see just in GDP and in sentiment is going to fuel more hiring.
Right. Beata, let me come back to you on this, on the European outlook. As Karen says, she's a bit more optimistic about Europe than lots of people are. Is there a fear here that these uncertainties on US trade and high energy prices, not to mention, of course, continuing conflict in Ukraine and so on, that Europe is really the sluggish one of the big blocks here, or are you a bit more optimistic about it?
Well, it's now or never moment for Europe, right? So the Draghi report gave us the diagnosis, and now it's up to European countries to start a conversation. So rather than complaining about things we cannot control in Europe, it's more productive to focus on finding sources of growth within Europe by implementing better the single market, by deepening it, by striking new free trade agreements. And because there are so many things on the table, every change creates winners and losers in the short term, but because there are so many things on the table, there is room for negotiation. So countries can gain a little, give in a little, and the EU and Europe will be better off as a result.
Right. Axel, we've got an interview that was running after this panel with Dina Friedman of NASDAQ, and we've talked to her about regulation and the differences in regulation between Europe and the US. And one of the key things that Trump is promising is obviously to try and lighten regulation. Cryptocurrency companies are out in force again here in Davos, loving the fact that they're going to be given a bit more of a freer rein by a Trump administration. What does that say about divergence between the two blocs, US and Europe, in terms of growth? I mean, growth is synonymous, according to business, with lighter regulation, but there's also smarter regulation, which I guess the regulators would say is what Europe might offer. What are you hearing about that?
Right, it's a big question. I would say, if you look at the past 20, 25 years, Europe has undoubtedly slipped behind both North America and Asia. I think it's quite clear. If you looked at the list of the world's highest valued companies in the 90s, a third of them or half of them were European, including some tech companies like Ericsson and Nokia. And now if you look at the list, it's almost only American companies. So, it says something about Europe's problems, and especially in the tech space. I think how to restore European competitiveness in tech, I think, is one of the biggest topics we should be discussing.
Yes.
But then, why is this then? Yeah, I think regulation, as you alluded to, is of course one of the reasons for this. I think Europe has taken a stance which is very pro-consumer, you could say. So if you look at the telcos, we have pushed down prices a lot, but it's fragmented the industry, whereas America has taken a very different stance. So there's clearly many areas where we could do more on regulation in Europe, and the US now with Trump will clearly deregulate even more. But I think Europe's problems are not only about regulation, it's a much, much broader range of issues.
Yes, and of course we literally, as Gideon and I were discussing, we saw those tech leaders ranked up, but behind Trump at his inauguration, which is sending a bit of a chill through some of the European business leaders I've been speaking to here. Karen, what are you hearing from business? What do you pick up with the signals that you can get from LinkedIn other than the hiring area that you were describing?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're able to see from our data at LinkedIn is that there are actually business leaders are still keenly focused on how to adopt AI in a way that is going to maximize their productivity. And I think definitely US companies are at the forefront of that. What's interesting is that it's both large companies and small companies. So it's not just a multinational story, but it's also medium-sized businesses are trying to think about how to play smarter. And a lot of this, I think, has to come back to this point about the Draghi report and the need for finding ways to be more competitive or to maintain that competitive edge. And even in the US, where I think we will see a kind of a positive growth gap, we will see productivity pulling ahead of Europe, American companies are still focused on how do they stay competitive amongst themselves. Mm-hmm. And they're leaning in towards using a lot of AI. So a lot of focus still on AI. And I would say also, if I could, just one last point, please. There is an element of worrying about fragmentation. I would completely agree with the point Beata made. But I think there's also a sense that there's still opportunities to be competitive by ranging across borders, by finding, for example, talent in places where it's cheaper, or setting up satellite offices in different countries. So we're still seeing a lot of that willingness to cross borders.
Yes. Beata, let me come to you on the Draghi report and industrial policy more generally, because industrial policy, as you've said, is obviously back. But it's hard to get the balance right between massive intervention that kind of distorts things, pushes in the wrong direction. You've seen this sort of overspill of overinvestment in some areas from China's industrial policy, for example, in renewables and other areas. How does one strike the balance? Once you've started, it's very hard to finish an industrial policy, and Trump has that challenge with the IRA, I think, as well.
Indeed. I mean, industrial policy is back. It's back with a vengeance, and it's back with public support. Yes. Everybody's doing it. The US, China, Germany, emerging Europe, India, and Brazil. But as you rightly pointed out, Andrew, it's very hard to get it right. And when we analyze the data on experience of 140 countries with industrial policy, we see some disturbing patterns. In 90% of cases in advanced economies, industrial policy discriminates against foreign interests. So these are local content requirements. This is restriction of public procurement to national companies. These are tariffs. So actually, there is a real danger that this enthusiasm for industrial policy will push further the fragmentation of the global economy. Because countries are doing industrial policy because others are doing it. Right? In Europe, we talk a lot about it because IRA created a threat of businesses leaving Europe and moving to the US, because subsidies in China are making it hard for European automakers to compete. In most cases, industrial policy has no expiry date. And that means that governments are signing up for spending money until they manage to roll it back. And that's very difficult politically. And also we see that industrial policy tends to have multiple objectives, and often they are on a collision course with each other. So it's hard to do it well.
Yes, so, Axel, to come to you on that, I mean, obviously Davos stands by a sort of free market globalizing approach. Industrial policy is not something that's been discussed so much up here during the previous years, but it is on the agenda very strongly as a kind of discussion point, at least in the fringes of what's going on here. What do you think is the future of industrial policy? Is it going to go down that protectionist road that Beata warns about, or is there smart industrial policy that can combine with smart regulation?
Yeah, good question. I think a couple of reflections. One is that industrial policy is back, and I mean the geopolitical game on industrial policy is back, no matter if we like it or not. But I think European governments could support their own industries and businesses more. So I think there's something to that. On the other hand, I think in Europe, industrial policy has often been understood as government should spend more, or government should spend more on R&D. And it's interesting when you look at the data, Europe has a very low R&D spend, but the problem is not that we have low government R&D spend, the problem is we have low private sector R&D spend. So I think it's very important for Europe. I think the industrial policy should be more deregulation, supporting our industry like other regions do, but then promoting private sector R&D spend, because that's our biggest problem. I was sitting in a discussion with some folks from the Netherlands this morning, and I think there are 4 or 5 American companies that on their own spend more on R&D than the Netherlands. Right. So 5 companies spend more than a European country.
Yes, that is a difficult number to match with no government can match that number. I mean, Karen, I mean, the business response, obviously, to industrial policy is, we'll have some of that if we can, but to Beata's point, you've got to keep going with it. Do you find that businesses that you talk to are keen to continue sucking in government money, or are they conscious of the risks?
I think what we're seeing right now is that they're quite keen to continue. There's a lot of opportunity in the US in particular through this industrial policy. It's created an enormous amount of jobs. And actually the pipeline for the demand for jobs is going to continue well into the next 3 to 4 years. So there are places right now that are being set up with plants to build batteries or support different types of alternative energy. And they are absolutely looking for hundreds, if not thousands, of engineers and plumbers. And so it's creating jobs in a lot of places where there weren't huge opportunities for people. The question is whether the skill match is there. But I think what we're seeing in our own list of, say, fastest growing jobs is that there's quite a lot of demand, and a lot of these jobs are related to huge industrial projects. So for us in our data, it seems quite keen, and I think it's actually going to be one of those catalysts along with cutting of interest rates that's going to keep growth solid, which is what my point was earlier.
Right, you brought up interest rates. I'm going to come back to Beata because we always like to talk about this. Clearly, it relates to the inflation question as well. But where are we, do you think, for this global economy in the interest rate cycle? Because we seem to be always afraid of inflation resurging, even though we thought that had been tamed. Probably this time last year, we may even have talked about it coming under control.
Well, I think that's a very difficult question given yesterday's announcement. But if I may come back to Axel's point about R&D, you mentioned several companies having enormous R&D spending. Actually, this concentration on R&D spending in a handful of companies is nothing new. I mean, already 20 years ago, 800 firms accounted for half of global R&D spending and 2/3 of business R&D spending. Now, what's different now is that before it was all concentrated in the home countries of multinationals. But now there is more R&D being done in foreign affiliates. And there is more R&D being done in cooperation between headquarters and affiliates. So these global collaborative patents that involve inventors in multiple countries are on the rise. Mm-hmm. So, we've been very focused in our discussion on trade in goods, but actually trade in services. And this R&D being done abroad is trade in services. That's on the rise, and we see it in countries where we are active, in emerging Europe, for instance.
Right. And, I mean, can you give us a little on the interest rate outlook, just while we're...
So what worries me is that, if the US interest rates will have to stay higher for longer, that's going to make lives of emerging markets and developing countries much harder. Budgets, debt is already high because of COVID and increased spending during that time. There are new pressures on budgets, particularly coming from defense spending. So servicing that, rolling over that is going to be harder. Now, on the positive side, what we see is that when the war in Ukraine started, emerging Europe saw an increase in the risk premium. It was charged by markets. That seems to have gone back to the pre-war level. So at least that's one positive development.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about skills, which you mentioned, and obviously that's a critical element of trying to keep the labour market aligned with what is needed. I mean, what are you picking up in terms of the kind of skills gap that might be emerging in some parts of the world?
So the biggest or fastest growing skills gap is the incredibly rapid demand for more AI talent, and the fact that the truth of the matter is less than 1% of the billion members plus on our platform are actually considered AI talent. So there's a huge demand and not enough supply, and so employers have the choice of competing with each other to try to hire that very small fraction of a % of AI talent globally that sometimes is in Eastern Europe or Central America and other places, India, and, or they can start to reskill their own talent pools, yes, which is what they're focused on. The other issue around skills is that we're seeing not just skills that are, let's say, AI related, where I want an AI engineer, I want an AI researcher, but also skills where people are increasingly looking for, if I could say it, human skills. It sounds very fuzzy and wishy-washy, but the truth is that as we get closer and closer to using technology, we want people who have enough sense to use it properly and push back against it, and that's where the human skills come in. So increasing growth there as well.
Right. Axel, we're going to be tackling AI directly later on in the later panel. But on the skills point, do you see optimism about the way in which that gap can be narrowed, or are we sort of navigating an uncertainty? Nobody I talk to, even the so-called experts, seems to know what kind of people we need for this future.
Yeah, I'm not so worried. I think that this is an industry that didn't exist a few years ago, and it's being built as we speak. And it's just like when the internet came or when social media came, over time the right skills for that is being built from talented people who are doing something different today. So I think that will happen. And I think it's also worth pointing out that when we say AI, many people think about AI-driven apps and ChatGPT or whatever, but it's really the whole ecosystem around AI, from chipsets through energy for fueling data centers. We will need so many data centers, data models, all the way up to the actual app. So there will be a whole industry around AI, some of them relatively boring industries, that will have huge growth in the coming years, and all of them will need a new set of skills.
Yes. Beata, switching back to you, we haven't talked about the green economy, which is obviously a large part of what certainly Davos discussion has been dominated by that in recent years. But there seems to be a sort of waning appetite, certainly on the part of the public, to take on the cost of green transition. We're talking about energy transition tomorrow in the show. But I'd be interested to get a sort of economist's view of how that is playing into growth prospects. It's clearly got potential if everybody goes for it.
So what we see, the good news is that people, 3/4 of people in 37 countries where we ran household surveys believe that climate change is real. They believe it will have a substantial impact on today's generation of children. People are concerned about loss of biodiversity, about air pollution, about extreme weather events. Where hesitance comes in is when you pose a question as an economic trade-off. Should governments prioritize environment over jobs? Are you willing to pay more taxes so that government can do more to fight climate change? So I think people want to see action. People actually want to see greater involvement of the state in the economy. That's one of the reasons why industrial policy is back. But they don't want to bear the cost. And I think that's the challenge for policymakers. The second challenge is to reassure people that structural changes that will be needed as a result of green transition will, that people will be able to sail through the changes, to make it through this transition period. When we look at the data and ask who are the people who are not willing to pay for green transition, these are typically people without college education. These are people who are in the bottom half of the earnings distribution. So these are people for whom making change of sector of employment, of profession, is more difficult. People who may not have a savings cushion that will carry them through this adjustment period. So I think governments need to do more to reassure people that they will be helped, that they will be assisted during that difficult time.
Right, and Axel, this might be one of those areas where the divergence between the US and Europe in particular will become particularly stark. We've got drill baby drill in the inauguration speech from Donald Trump, and we've got Europe still committed to the climate change and energy transition agenda, despite the reluctance of the public to come on board.
For sure. No, I mean, that divergence will continue now for a while, I think. I also find it fascinating that many companies that had very ambitious sustainability agendas just a couple of years ago are backing off pretty fast when they see what Trump is doing in America, which I find very disappointing, because I mean there has to be certain things you believe in and that you want to push no matter what the certain administration wants to do. But anyway, I think that back to the economic point, there are many measures that are still in the money, and many technologies that are very exciting for the future, like heat pump technology. If you put in 1 kilowatt hour of electricity, you can get out 4, 5, 6 kilowatt hours of heat. So I mean, many of those are in the money, and I mean the transition is ongoing. It's more a question, how long will this take?
Yes. Karen, this is perhaps not something that LinkedIn monitors, but the businesses that you talk to, I mean, Axel says companies in the US backing off from that agenda, but my sense is that some of them are just being quiet about it, silent even about it, but they still believe there's a business case for pushing forward with that and the other progressive agendas that Trump has perhaps come out against.
So what we see in our data is, interestingly, like one of the fastest growing jobs in the UK, for example, was sustainability manager last year. So it's still there. It's definitely very present in Europe, and European companies are still, I think, retaining a lot of commitment. The commitment in the US may be quieter, but when you think about the number of data centers that are being built, the demand for energy sources, the fact that so many young people in the US, millennials, Gen Z, they are still, I think, interested in a future that thinks about sustainability. And we see those jobs still on the platform. And if you are in a green sector, you are getting hired more quickly than if you're in a non-green sector.
Yes.
So the hiring rates are still telling us that those are in demand.
Yes. I'd like to kind of switch to just in the last few minutes, just taking a quick look, since we're on day one of the Davos Daily Show, at what we think is the future of this forum, the World Economic Forum, and what's happening here in Davos. You heard Gideon sounding a little bit gloomy about the way in which some of the preoccupations of the globalizers up here would be soft-pedaled or even moved aside over the Trump era. Beata, you're a veteran of many Davoses. Do you think you'll be coming here still in 5 years' time in the post the second Trump presidency?
I think Davos is going to continue. And I think sooner or later, the pendulum is bound to swing. And we are going to be discussing reglobalization here.
Right. Axel, similarly?
No, I mean, I'm a big believer in globalization, and I mean, we can just go back to our university textbooks. There's huge economic benefit in globalization for all of us if we can manage it. So I think it's just a period of time before we see globalization swing back. And I think Davos is such a great forum for meeting CEOs and important decision makers. I'm sure it will continue.
Right. Karen, are you also an optimist on the Davos?
I'm an optimist, but I have to say, I wonder if Davos should be in Davos.
This is interesting.
It's lovely. It's lovely, but the carbon footprint's quite large.
Yeah, that's a fair point. There's a lot of nostalgia for the summer Davos that we had briefly after COVID, because we don't have to put on our boots and yomp around. And as you rightly say, there's a lot of people coming from a long distance to get right up to the top of the mountain. So arguably it has some selling to do to get itself into that proper, globalized, and environmentally friendly world. Anyway, thank you all three of you, Beata, Axel, and Karen, for joining me for the first panel of our Davos Daily Show this year. We'll be back shortly with that interview with Adina Friedman, NASDAQ Chair and CEO, talking to me about markets, IPOs, and regulation. Stay with us.
Tech has limitless potential, but how do we turn that into value? Unlock the power of AI at scale, reinvent tech delivery, build innovative products, and entirely new businesses. We rewire organizations to get the most out of tech. From strategy and talent, to operating model, data and governance, capabilities, and culture. Great tech is essential, but with McKinsey, it's never just tech.
Adina, welcome. Welcome to the Davos Daily Show. It's obviously going to be a pretty momentous year. We've got a new president in the United States. What's the economic outlook looking like from where you sit at NASDAQ?
Well, first of all, Andrew, it's great to be here, so thank you very much. And it is the dawn of a new era, in terms of the next administration coming into the United States. And as we look at the year, but also as we've been listening to our clients over the last several months, as they're gearing up for this year, I think there are a couple key themes. One is it's going to be what I would say more of a risk-on environment for investors in terms of they're getting more excited to have new companies come and list and having new sources of capital to invest in. And we're definitely starting to see the IPO calendar firm up in ways that we haven't seen for a while. So we're excited about that. I think that the second is that it is generally a pro-growth kind of a lean-in type of environment that I've heard from many of my corporate peers in terms of thinking about ways and avenues for growth that may be opened up for them under the new administration. So we see that as generally positive. And at the same time, over the last several years, I think the U.S. economy and other economies have demonstrated a lot of resilience in a period of great upheaval and change. So you're starting with a pretty good base, and then seeing the potential for this to be a growth-oriented administration, I think, could be quite helpful and to the economy in general.
So pretty optimistic. Anything that you're afraid of? It could be a volatile time as well, couldn't it?
Well, we've been dealing with volatility now for 5 straight years. So in a way, volatility has become kind of the new normal. And I think that as we see the fact that there will be changes in the policies of the administration, there will be changes that are introduced in reaction to those policies from the administration. And those things, the markets will react to those as they come. But what's interesting is, I would say, a little bit more of a general undercurrent of they understand the cost of capital environment for the most part. It's going back and forth a bit, but at least it's not an unknown as to where it's going to top out. So there's the question is how quickly will it cool down? And then the second is the fact that they do feel like there is the potential for there to be a pro-growth agenda. So those two things create a sense of optimism that allow investors to potentially put more capital to work in a more fundamental way than perhaps they have in the last several years. And so I think that actually, even with the potential for there to be some market volatility, if you have that ballast, it creates a little bit more stability in the markets in general.
Right, and you talk about growth. Obviously, nobody can object to growth, really, done in the right way, and the way in which that might fill the pipeline for IPOs. But, there are some voices out there. I mean, surprisingly, David Solomon last week, CEO of Goldman Sachs, saying that entrepreneurs should exercise great caution before listing their babies. And this is Goldman Sachs, the great facilitator of IPOs, you would tend to think of them. I mean, does that give you pause that actually some of this growth will be directed into the private capital markets and away from the public markets that represents? I mean,
personally, I'm always of the view that there's a balance between the private markets and the public markets. And it's interesting because we've been looking at that in terms of understanding, well, how much capital is being deployed in the public markets versus the private markets. There's about $112 trillion of capital devoted to the public markets today, and about $15 trillion devoted to the private markets today. So the public markets still are enormous as compared. Right. And the investable capital is growing in general. So it can lift all boats. But the fact is that there are some challenges to being a public company today that we think that they're, again, an administration that's more geared towards growth and innovation. There are new ways that they could think about regulation that could make it so that to be a public company is not such a huge leap from a controls and a regulatory perspective, that we would like to see create a little bit better balance. And at the same time, we see an enormous number of really terrific companies that are ready to tap the public markets. It's just a matter of the moment in their lives as a public company or as a company. Do they feel that there's predictability in their revenue? Do they feel that they can manage through a cost of capital environment that might be changing? Those types of things are going to be things that investors evaluate and examine and assess them on. But if they are, then they're going to be ready. And frankly, as we know, being public is a huge, huge driver of growth. You get access to capital. You can attract and retain your employees. You can use your capital for acquisitions. I mean, there are a lot of things that can be done in the public markets that are very attractive to companies. And so it still is a major draw.
Right. And I mean, let's talk about regulation, because you mentioned it there. And obviously, a lot of the discussion is about what type of regulation works. The sense among Republicans and the incoming administration that regulation got too heavy in the US and that they're going to lighten it. What type of regulation suits you?
Yeah, well, I believe in regulation in the financial industry and in many industries. because I think you want to make sure that you have a base of controls and competence that drives investor protection and it drives integrity in the system. So I'm a big believer that regulation is something that should underpin the industry. At the same time, I think that there's regulation that's what I call smart regulation, which would be outcome-driven regulation. What outcomes are you trying to achieve? Have you thought through the unintended consequences of those outcomes? Because once you write a regulation into a rule, it tends to be relatively persistent, even in a changing environment. But if you've really thought it through and you're focused on outcomes as opposed to inputs, then I think you can allow the flexibility for companies to use new technologies and new methods to achieve those outcomes. What I think we've actually been seeing in the last decade or more, ever since the credit crisis, has been a growing amount of regulation in the industry that's more input-oriented. Check the box on process, check the box on controls, but not necessarily achieving the outcomes it was designed to achieve. And I think that creates a tax on the industry and actually a tax on the economy. So we've looked at it just in terms of the regulatory and compliance part of banks. There's probably an opportunity for them to save about 10 to 20% of their cost on compliance and regulation solely by taking out the process, like in a way rewriting the process and applying new technologies. And if they do that, that's freeing up kind of $25 to $50 billion of capital of just run rate income. And if they were then to deploy that into the market, it would be an enormous boost to the economy. So there are ways to do regulation that we think are more effective and efficient. And similarly for public companies, to be a public company today is a big obligation. And I think that there are some certain elements of it that are very important for investor protection, and there are others that we probably need to re-examine.
And are you worried that actually investors will be less protected under this incoming administration with its plans, at least as far as we know them so far?
I haven't seen anything that I would say will suddenly make it so investors are less protected. But I do think they'll examine regulations to say, okay, what are the true consequences? What are you really trying to drive towards? And we will obviously, in our commentary and certainly in engaging with regulators, be very focused on investor protection, be very focused on safety and soundness, but also recognizing that there's probably a lot you could do to lighten the load and still be just as effective.
Right. I want to talk briefly about crypto. I mean, about half of the emails that have been bombarding me on my way up to the mountain this year have been from cryptocurrency companies or blockchain companies, really enjoying this kind of wave of sort of change, a vibe shift, I called it earlier today, from a couple of years ago when they were more or less banned from Davos. What's the kind of future of crypto, do you think, under the US? And does NASDAQ have a part of that? You suspended your crypto custody plans at some point.
Yeah, so, well, first of all, we do have a big role to play as a technology provider because we, in fact, provide technology to crypto exchanges, right, trading, clearing, settlement, surveillance. And we also list the crypto instruments onto the exchange, like the crypto ETFs that we have, IBIT, and others. So I actually, we do play a role in the ecosystem. My view of crypto in the United States is it's matured a lot in the last 3 years out of necessity. But as you've seen the maturation of the markets, and you've seen the fact that a lot of the challenges that the industry is facing have kind of been addressed through enforcement, now it's a matter of, okay, let's now be proactive and write the rules. It's time for a regulatory environment that allows the crypto exchanges and the entire crypto ecosystem to have an understanding of what are the rules of the road, what are they expected to operate within. I think if we can go from enforcement to proactive rule writing with a smart regulation approach to things, with an investor protection lens, it could actually allow the whole crypto ecosystem to mature faster and give birth to new opportunities for investment, but within the confines of a well-regulated, investor protected marketplace.
And if you reach that point, could NASDAQ then come back in with a crypto custody plan, for example?
Well, certainly if there are, part of the reason we chose not to launch our crypto custody solution was that there was so much change happening on the back of the enforcement actions. It was very difficult to understand the regulatory landscape we would be operating in even a year from then. And we like certainty, and we operate in regulated markets. That's kind of what we do, and it's what we do well. So if there is a very clear regulatory regime that we understand and we can operate in and predict, then we would be more interested in potentially even playing a bigger role in the space. But right now we have a really important role to play as a technology partner to the industry.
Right. NASDAQ's got this position that some viewers might not be aware of because you're so obviously a US brand in the Nordics and the Baltics with markets there and exchanges there, which gives you an interesting lens into the European situation. I just wonder if you're worried about there's a divergence here between the US pro-growth, pro-innovation, light touch regulation and what's going to be happening in Europe. What views do you have about the comparison between the two as we go into this difficult year?
Well, first, we are extremely proud of the fact that we are the owner and operator of the markets in many of the countries in the Nordics and the Baltics. It's actually a point of great pride for me personally. I just find it amazing to see the innovation ecosystem that exists in Sweden and Finland and Denmark, and the fact that we play a small role in supporting that. So it's really it's terrific. But actually, in fact, I would say that the European regulatory landscape is shifting. They are very focused, as the Capital Markets Union. They're very focused on figuring out ways to make the system work better in terms from a regulatory perspective. Are all the regulations necessary? Are there too many layers of regulators, in the region? Can we operate in a more streamlined environment here in Europe and still be as effective at investor protection? And I think there are many, many opportunities for that. And in fact, there's a lot of engagement on the notion of the next generation of the capital markets in Europe. So I actually think that this is a moment where the European regulatory apparatus could seize the moment and really think and take action in a way that could drive a lot more innovation and create a better innovation ecosystem and investment ecosystem here in Europe as well.
Is there one thing that the US could learn from the European system?
Yeah, actually, the one thing that's interesting is the European rules, at least that govern capital markets, are more principles-based, whereas the US are more rote rules.
Sure.
And I actually think that there are a lot of benefits to a principle-based approach because of the fact that it can evolve. You can look at again, it's outcome-oriented. The principle is we want you to achieve certain level of investor protection and best execution, for instance. Well, you figure out the best way to do that. Well, that actually can be a way to create more flexibility to allow for new technologies and new externalities to kind of fit into the system. As opposed to it being so prescriptive that it can't change with the times. So I actually think that there's some benefit to that.
Right. I've got to ask you about DEI, not only because you're a prominent female executive, but also because NASDAQ had a board diversity rule struck down in the courts before Christmas, and clearly there is a backlash against some elements of DEI policy. What is the state of play, and where are we heading here? I mean, there's a danger of going backwards, I suspect.
Well, I can only talk about NASDAQ, and I think within NASDAQ, we have our programs that bring in great talent from lots of different backgrounds. The most important thing we do is create a culture of inclusivity to make sure that we make everyone feel that once they're there, they belong with us, that they can thrive within NASDAQ, that there are a lot of career opportunities within NASDAQ across the whole spectrum of diversity. And I think that for us, that's just a part of our ethos. It's part of who we are, and it's actually one of the great things that makes us successful is creating that kind of culture within our organization and attracting talent. So I don't anticipate changing that. I think that as each company is going to have to make their own choices as to how they want to look at those programs, but that's the way that we've chosen. In terms of our rule, we are very proud of the fact that we had a rule that was meant to actually make it more simple for investors and corporates to evaluate governance from a diversity perspective. The whole idea was to make it simple and straightforward in terms of disclosures for the governance. And the companies all went about it. They did their tables. It was actually quite straightforward. But the fact is we will also respect the court's decision and move on. And we think, though, that modern governance is now a part of the ethos of the new use case, or it's how the technology is developing new ways. I'm very excited to learn about that. And then with regard to the financial ecosystem and the financial system, I actually have a lot of meetings with both regulators as leaders as well as banks. So understanding what their focuses are for this year, how we can support them and partner with them, it's always great to have that opportunity to talk to them.
Well, Adina, thanks very much for spending time with us. Adina Friedman.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the second live panel of today's Davos Daily Show. We're joined by an expert panel to discuss expectation and reality and the effect of AI on economic growth. We have Raj Verma from the database technology company SingleStore, Christina Montgomery, Chief Privacy and Trust Officer from IBM, and Rodney Zemmel from McKinsey. AI has been the topic of Davos for the last couple of years, really, and again this year. One thing that I'm noting already is that I'm hearing the same thing I heard a year ago. People saying that this year will be the year of execution. This will be the year when we put the flesh on the bones of generative AI and AI more generally. And now the experimentation is over. That's what I heard this time last year. So, Raj, where are we on the spectrum between hype and reality for AI? We're obviously still in the early period, but where are we?
Well, I think a few comments. Firstly, I think the first time I heard about AI being discussed at scale in Davos was 2016. That coincided with the fourth industrial revolution and all the rest of it. And at that time, I was also skeptical about the fact that, machines would replace humans by 2045. And I was like, there's no way that's going to happen. And then there were other topics that were topical at Davos for a few years. And then last year, I think it was all about AI, right? And people were skeptical that previous year was cryptocurrency and Bitcoin and all the rest of it. So I guess the fact that it's been the topic for 2 consecutive years in Davos says that it's probably more a reality than the hype. Also, if you see the difference between this time last year and now, ChatGPT-4 is multimodal, so you can actually point it to the studio and they'll be like, oh, there's a great-looking crew and great-looking equipment. There's a camera. It costs this much. These are the manufacturers. It's multimodal. I think the difference between the previous version and this version is probably orders of magnitude. So there has been progress for sure. In fact, talk about our own lives. I think our own lives have been augmented by AI for sure, whether it's the Copilot for Excel or some of the other tools that you use in the office for productivity. In our organization, I think we've gotten at least a 40% greater efficiency out of our engineering and software development using AI than we had this time last year. We probably have a double-digit number of AI tools which are driving efficiency within our organization. I think there isn't a meeting that I have had in the last 8 months with a client where we haven't spent at least 50% of the conversation that's not about AI and how to go about it. So short answer is, I think it's a reality. I think the biggest thing stopping people from, or AI to grow, is the sentiment that the limitations of AI are durable. They actually aren't. I mean, what we thought, last year I did not think that AI would impact software development to the extent that it has in the last 12 months.
Right.
So I think these limitations will go away over time, and I am a big believer that this is the new way of life.
Right. Christina, let me come to you. What's the sort of view from IBM and the view from your perch in IBM of where we are in this hype versus reality spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, I would characterize last year as really a year of experimentation in terms of lots of pilots and lots of scaling across the workplace, for IBM at least, to think about use cases. Like every individual's perspective, every job role's perspective is different and unique. And I've always felt, and this plays out in reality, and I've witnessed it over the last year in particular, that it's very cross-disciplinary in terms of its technology, in terms of its impact. So we have run things like Watson X challenges across our business where everyone is tasked with come up with a project where AI can help you do your job better and then develop it. And some of those go from pilot into production. A number of assistants have been created even across my team in the law department or in a compliance team. We've developed assistants to help us address compliance-related issues and to help get answers into the hands of our constituents across the company more easily and more readily and increase productivity and the like. So I think what we'll see over the next year is really this ability to take more from a pilot phase into an adoption phase. And for that, you need to really further democratize the technology and have every individual understand this is not something that's happening to you. You hold the power to decide how you're going to use this technology to make your life, your job, easier. We've seen a lot of that over the last year, and I think we'll see more in the coming years for sure. I think we're in very early days.
Right. Rodney, you're global leader in McKinsey Digital and for firm-wide AI transformation. So your job is dependent on being able to roll this out further and move up the spectrum towards reality. I mean, how far would you say, I suppose there are two parts here, McKinsey clients and then there's McKinsey itself. So where again would you say you are on that scale?
Yeah, so Andrew, I'm not sure what's on the agenda at Davos is really the bellwether of human progress. And I hope they don't cancel my badge for saying that. But look, AI is a 70-year story at this point, right? This is from the 1950s, right? It's been through its ups and downs. And I think from 2023, re-exploded in energy thanks to generative AI. I don't know we're going to be talking about generative AI specifically 5 years from now. There'll be something else that'll be combined with reinforcement learning, other things and so on. So where are we in the hype to impact cycle? It's both, right? The tech industry is the best hype machine on the planet, so of course there's hype. But there's also very real impact, right? I mean, think without trying too hard, 10 companies who've announced in their earnings more than $1 billion of impact from AI. Inside McKinsey, I can go deeper into this as you like, but we built our own AI knowledge agent, Lily, that we now have 85% of our firm using 17 times a week on average. So it's here. And I think maybe what's different from the conversation this year and last year is I am hearing sort of believers and non-believers in the chief executives I spend time with. People who are doing it right, so to speak, right, are seeing enormous impact in their organizations. I was with a leader in one financial institution who says they've doubled their economic impact from AI, not just generative AI, but AI, every year for the past 4 years, and they're debating whether doubling it again for this year is enough or not. And every time you hear someone saying, is there really value there, they rub their hands and say, that leaves more for us. Now, maybe that's a particular banking perspective, but I think that illustrates the difference between the people who are doing it and the people who are still piloting it. And by the way, it's across industry. I mean, I mentioned the bank, but consumer companies, automotives, people who have leaned into it, I think have captured the value.
And what's holding back the non-believers, would you say?
Human beings. I think 2024 was the year technology delivered and the humans didn't quite. And one of our observations in mid last year was the biggest beneficiaries of generative AI so far are the dogs of software developers. Because every software developer, to your example, Raj, figured out how to save 20 minutes a day so they can go home and walk the dog, right? Or whatever it is they want to do. You don't see that in the P&L, right? So how you aggregate that up into something that you can really see at a company level, right? How you don't think about just giving a bunch of tools to an organization and letting people just try what they like, versus instead thinking about how do you actually change the software development lifecycle, have a team work together properly in ways you can actually measure and monitor with a top-down financial target. That's the difference between a bunch of pilots and actually capturing economic value.
Yes. So Raj, just to dig bit deeper into that 40% greater efficiency that you said you achieved at Single Store over the last year, where has that come from? I mean, where is the main area that you found that efficiency advantage?
Yeah, I think basic short answer in the co-pilots,
right.
In the various co-pilots that our engineers have used. Just further to Rodney's point in software development, I think it was Mark Zuckerberg or Elon or someone who did say that this year, 2025, would be the year where AI would be equivalent to a medium-grade software engineer in a company. So that's what the promise is for 2025, right? And I do think there are a couple of ways that I see the evolution of AI, Andrew. I think the first phase would be the easy getting automated, all right? So the easy tasks, the repetitive tasks would get automated. And we are seeing a lot of that happening and happened over the course of the last year or so. The second bit, which is where it gets more interesting, is the hard becoming easy. And I'll give you an example. I was talking to one of the drug manufacturers, actually out of this country, and they predict that in the next year or so, in the next 5 years, you would be able to discover a drug and get an FDA approval in 12 months. Right? So, I mean, that was unfathomable, right? And as they go down that, there is a drug discovery element. So if you want to, apparently if you have to discover a drug, you identify the problem and the scientists go away and then they come back with 1,000 molecules that you start the discovery process through. With AI, they have reduced that to 20. So the drug discovery is now 50x faster using AI than it was not using AI. Now that's where the hard is getting easy. And the third element would be where the impossible becomes possible. And just using the drug example, there would be compounds that you could discover. There'll be more compounds discovered in the next decade than, say, chemistry has been on for 500 years, 1600s, right? In the next decade than they have been in the last 500 years. So that impact of AI, I believe, would be game-changing.
Right. I mean, Christina, obviously IBM's a technology company, so you encourage people to do more with their technology and new technology. They're going to go for it, and you're going to be fine with that. But there is a sort of trust element to this, and that's in your portfolio. How do you strike the balance between saying, go for it, we just want to see what you can do with this, and going, hang on, that might go a little bit too far? I was actually wondering, when you were talking about the balance between stuff that works inside, we can do more compliance internally using this, and stuff that gets released into the wild to customers, for example.
Yeah, it's funny, like being here in Davos, this is my first time here, but IBM put out our first recommendations around AI regulation here at Davos in 2020. Okay. So 5 years ago. And our point of view has not changed in those 5 years. We are very much proponents of what we call a precision regulation or risk-based regulation. So you focus the regulatory activity on use cases, on those high-risk uses of AI, things like, HR applications in employment. How much do you defer to an AI algorithm to determine whether somebody is suitable for a job or gets a loan? Or in the medical context, there's high risk, that if the AI isn't trusted, the algorithm isn't dependable, you're causing real harm to people. However, if you regulate broadly across the technology, first of all, you can't regulate math, you can't regulate software. You cannot and should not be focusing regulation on an algorithm. And by enabling low-risk uses of AI, those restaurant recommendations versus, for example, credit or loan decisions, you are enabling the innovation to continue, and you're also addressing the real problem of trust. So regardless of whether there's regulation or not, You need this technology to be trusted. We need people to understand how to work with it. We need them to feel confident when you're deploying something, that the outcome is something that is expected, and that you're getting actual, in a business context in particular, that you're getting an accurate recommendation from an algorithm, for example. So what I've seen is a tremendous amount of maturity in the last 5 years, and the conversations around regulation, that focus on risk-based regulation, I think is really critical, that focus on accountability. But I also think, people sort of confuse, it comes back to governance, but governance is important irrespective of regulation, right? It comes back to this point of trust, and it also comes back to the point of being able to accelerate and adopt at scale and with speed. Governance supports innovation. If you don't have, we were talking before the panel started about just data governance, right? If you don't have governance around the data you're using to train models, you are not only wasting time, but you're creating potentially real risk. So it's not just about risk. You want this all to come back to, how do I accelerate adoption at speed and scale, and for results that are going to bring value to my business? I don't know that I'm getting value out of what I'm putting in if I don't have governance around that.
Are you afraid that there might be some highly public blow-up of an AI tool that will set back trust? I mean, I'm thinking most recently of Apple, for example, suddenly having to withdraw that product that started to rewrite BBC and other headlines and put them out as alerts. Each one sort of cuts away a little bit of trust that might have been built up, right?
Yeah, each one does, and we've seen a number of them over the years. It's not the end of seeing, those kinds of, I would say, more along the lines of hiccups. I mean, the real risk is in security spaces and the like, right, where we need to be, sort of extra careful in terms of the safety protocols and the like, which is why focusing on things like red teaming and bias testing continue to be sort of issues that you need to have in place in your organization, again, focused on context. That's where this precision regulation point is really critical, right? It's like, what is the use case for the particular algorithm? It's not the same test that can be run on the same. If you look at large language models, we have our own Granite series of large language models. They're more trained for enterprise use cases, but even if you look across, the Llamas and the ChatGPTs and the Claudes and the like, each of those LLMs could be used in a multitude of use cases. That's the value, but the testing and the like needs to take into context that use, and should be really focused on, the high risk use cases of the AI, as opposed to just each and every time that you're deploying AI.
You don't want to keep applying the sledgehammer to everything unless you need the sledgehammer.
Exactly.
Rodney, just on the kind of balance between heavy-handed regulation and lighter regulation, obviously Trump's inauguration suggests we're going to come into a more lighter regulated world. I was talking to Adina Friedman in the interview we showed just before this panel about that. In the case of AI, is there a risk, to Christina's point, that regulation got wrong will cramp growth and actually destroy some of the advantages that AI could bring over the years?
Regulation is always going to be lagging. One of my colleagues told me, I haven't checked if this is true, I should, the stop sign was standardized 70 years after the car was invented, right? So, I think the AI regulation might not take 70 years, but you can guarantee the models and what companies are doing are going to be running ahead of the regulation. That's why, actually, in line with what we just heard, right, what we tell people we work with is it's actually not about, minimum compliance with the regulation. Of course you have to do that, right? But actually it's about how do you go further and really build digital trust with all of your stakeholders, right? Your customers, your employees, your investors, everybody. And really thinking about what digital trust means and not just what compliance with regulation means is going to be critical. Now, that said, the fact that we're now in a world where regulation appears quite different or has the potential to be quite different by region, that's a challenge, right? And we're certainly in a time when companies are going to need to think about more bifurcated technology strategies than they were because of regulation, because of export restrictions and so on. And there's some complex sort of strategy questions in there. But regulation is part of it, but that's almost it's literally the minimum standard.
Yes, I mean, the differentiation there is an interesting point. I've already heard up here that the concentration of the sort of technology knowledge in the United States is making European technology companies and others a little bit wary. They're thinking, do we really want all our AI to
It's a more nuanced debate. So our math is 22% of the world's AI talent, I'll say because we're here in Europe, 22% of the world's AI talent is actually European. Only 14% of it stays in Europe, right? So there's a massive exodus, right? Will that change? Will that change the direction that it flows in? You know, maybe. But there's a huge opportunity for Europe to build on the AI talent base that it has. And look, the US has some phenomenally successful tech and software companies that will continue. But when we look at how quickly this market is changing, right? It's, you know, I don't think anywhere else is out for the count, right? I think it's a more diverse world in software than the headlines might have you believe.
Yeah, Raj, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, no, I was just saying, you know, of course, the new administration is just taking shape. So I believe in less regulation for sure, right? And I think it was Adina who was saying this morning that it's more about smart regulations than anything else, right? And precision regulations and all the rest of it. I think the one thing that I was against, and those were the rumblings that we were hearing from the previous administration, was the fact that they will mandate who can do AI and who cannot. And I'm not a big believer in that. I come from the Valley. Innovation is in the very reason why people like me live there, right? So I think that was not something I would have, you know, stood behind. I do not think that we should completely deregulate it either. I think there has to be the usage of AI, like you said, and, you know, I'm a father. So, you know, it's just very important for me that, you know, teenagers' rights and their mental health is protected, right? And I think it can have a tremendous impact if not regulated. That I think is absolutely critical. However, there is a lot of self-regulation that you could impose if you are an ethical organization, all right? So a lot of our customers, which are Fortune 500, are deploying AI, and quite frankly, you know what is the ethical use of it and what isn't, right? You can pretend you don't, but you do. So I do not really think that regulations are going to be a big, you know, up or down in the usage of AI. And I think, lastly, the international regulations, which I think Rodney alluded to, US, EMEA, and then China, is less about, I don't think anyone disagrees that they don't want the next World War to be started by a machine or our digital identities not being protected on the web, etc. But the difference really is, how do you want to govern society? So the freedom, you know, sort of march of freedom in the US versus the Aristotle mentality in Europe versus Confucius in China is really the difference in the regulation and a global regulation coming into place. But I think I'm extremely helpful. There is a lot of priority being given. I don't know if you saw the inauguration yesterday. You had Bezos, and you had Elon, and you had Sundar, and you had Mark Zuckerberg right there. So that does signify that the administration would be very friendly towards big tech, and I think it's good for all of us.
You see, that's exactly what's frightening some people in Europe, for example, and indeed some who aren't in big tech in the US. I'm already hearing that here. Is that not just a potential problem in the offing, the oligarchy of big tech around
I think that's exaggerated, in my opinion. I do think that the US, not only because I live there, I think from an AI perspective or from an innovation perspective, has led the world. And if you stifle that, then you kill a part of both that society and what that country is all about. So to people like us, companies like us, we see that as a very positive sign.
Right. It comes back to your point, and I want to emphasize this, on the future being one where you don't just have a handful of companies being the creator and everybody else builds on top of that. That's a really important point, and I think it addresses the concern in part that you raise. So one of our point of views is that the future of AI should be open. Everyone should be a creator. We don't want there to be 4 or 5 tech companies that are creating every model. there's going to be a whole hybrid approach to model creation. There'll be there'll be not just the large language models, but there'll be smaller models. Every company will create their own models to some extent, build on others. So we have to make sure in the regulation world that we're not sort of preventing, for example, open source software. There was a lot of focus, and if you rewind the debate on regulation to even 2023, when I testified in front of the first Senate hearing along with Sam Altman and Gary Marcus on AI, the conversations there were very much about, how do we close this off? There should be an Uber regulator and we should be regulating the technology. We've always said absolutely not. We should be regulating the use, not the technology. And that's how that and enabling an open ecosystem, those are really important points if we want the future to be one where everyone can participate.
Right. I mean, Rodney, do you or your clients worry about this concentration or possible concentration of the sort of tech? Or are you, to your point about the 22% still coming from Europe, do you think there's still enough to play for in this, that it's not already a lost game for the Europeans, for example?
I think tech has always surprised us with how quickly innovators can come up. I mean, look at the companies we're talking about today as giants, right? And even if you take the Davos agenda as the bellwether, right, they would not have been allowed anywhere near the main stage not that long ago, right? So it moves quickly. And I think what we need to be careful of in this debate, and I think you alluded to it and when you mentioned this Senate hearings, is there are some things that are being positioned as societal questions that are actually, I think, business-to-business debates between different factions of the tech industry. Oh, okay. So, look, does the world need regulation? And yes, in moderation, of course, right? I think where most people would be, and you've got to make sure there's the right range of inputs to that regulation. And industry is one, and making sure that within industry you're getting a broad range of segments.
Yes, we've talked a lot about regulation. I'd like to kind of go out on the sort of positives here of the technology, and perhaps I'd like to ask you each to think about perhaps one instance. Raj has already given the drug discovery example, but other instances in which AI is already showing that promise and changing the way in which people are working with it. I was talking to somebody this morning about digital cloning, if you like, of the human body to be able to detect with the input of actual physical testing, detect what's going to happen to your heart under certain circumstances, which has all sorts of applications from elite sport to disease prevention and so on. Who would like to kind of throw in a first shining example of where AI already is showing that promise?
Yeah, I think I'll pick up on your example. I think that sort of high-end digital twin one of like advanced scientific problems is super interesting, right? I mean, we've seen what's been done with protein folding. I actually think what's happening with drug safety, right? And excuse me, companies that have pooled their data on drug safety and allowing you to come up with much better models for how drugs are metabolized by the body and what is and isn't safe. That's an enormous opportunity. But what's interesting is people tend to reach for these like high-end examples. I'll give you a much lower-end medical example. So primary care diagnostics, right? Someone walks into a clinic and the doctor diagnoses them, right, of what's wrong with them, what do they have. So there was a study done towards the end of last year where they set up to see how do doctors perform versus how do doctors using one of the LLMs perform. And what they saw was that doctors were 71% accurate in their diagnosis, right? Maybe a little lower than the general population would guess, but 71%. Give them the model, 74%. And the doctors were like, great, okay, this is a useful tool. It helps us a bit, it's worth using, and so on. They also had an arm of the study where they said the model alone. The model alone was 90-something% accurate. So doctors plus the model was worse than just the model. So I think we've got ahead of us everybody's saying human in the loop, these technologies should be co-pilots, not autopilot and so on. And of course that's true from sort of a safety and control standpoint. But it's not going to be long before this isn't just doing what humans do faster, but it'll be truly doing things better than humans can do it. And doing things that humans can't even imagine how they would do.
Yes. And in fact, just to add to that, they said that if you're going and having a colonoscopy, it's actually not the doctor that matters. It's time of the day that you do the colonoscopy. Because if you do it after 4, it's his whatever 7th, 8th, 10th colonoscopy, and he's just tired. Human fatigue tends to set in, and they have the wrong diagnosis. Whereas the LLM, there is no fatigue element to it, right? The interesting, just to add to that, one of the interesting things I was listening to the other day, that say you can start reading from the age of 5, right? And you live till 75, and you read 24 hours a day, and you remember everything that you've read. Your vocabulary or the knowledge that you would have gained is 8 billion words, yeah? In today's CPU capacity or GPU capacity or compute capacity, you can train an LLM in a month with a vocabulary of 9 billion words, right? So the fact that the content in the LLMs would be far superior to what we humans can retain, that's a given. There is no if, and buts about that. But to answer your question in specificity, we were talking to the CEO of a medical device company, and he says, look, we have almost mastered the cardiac element of it. In fact, we have to switch your heart off, he was joking, once you die, pacemaker, right? Yeah. But the neurological element, or the neuroscience in the brain, is one element which is still a mystery. And he thinks AI in that area and in the gene mutation or mutation of cancer and linked to how various different genes are correlated, those two are, and for personal reasons, or reasons personal to me rather, those are the two that I'm most excited about.
Right. Christina, letting you have the last word. Do you have a GWiz case?
Oh, great. Well, a GWiz case, I think, which highlights the open conversation, right, and some really important conversations around climate as well. So an example, IBM and NASA partnered together to create a large language model that took all of the geospatial data that NASA has available into a model that can help predict climate change. And because it's accessible across basically to anybody, it's an open model, you can help address problems in your region, problems to you as a farmer, for example, in Africa, or a scientist in California, fires, that type of thing. It's available to all, and it's leveraging data we already have and training a special purpose model for that. And I think we will see more of those kinds of use cases as well over the years.
Great. Well, we're out of time. We have had an excellent discussion and ended on an optimistic note, so that is good for the first day of the Davos Daily Show. Join us again same time tomorrow for our discussion of the transition to the low-carbon economy, another vital discussion that's going on up here in Davos. I'm Andrew Hill. Thank you for joining us, and see you tomorrow.